The day I started college, something happened to my eyes that I still can't fully explain. One ordinary morning, I woke up, blinked at the water-stained ceiling of my dorm room, sat up, and looked across the room at my roommate, who was still snoring with one leg hanging off his bed. And there, hovering just above his head, glowing faint and steady like a phone screen left on in a dark room, was a number. I rubbed my eyes. It didn't go away. I closed one eye, then the other. Still there. I actually stood up, walked to the mirror bolted crookedly to our closet door, and stared at my own reflection for a solid 2 minutes, half expecting to see a number over my own head, too. Nothing. Just my tired face and the collar of a t-shirt I'd worn 3 days in a row. I spent that entire first week of college treating the whole thing like a private science experiment nobody had signed off on. My roommate, perpetually broke, always 5 yuan short for instant noodles, always borrowing my leftover rice, had a number that matched his complaining almost perfectly. A senior down the hall, who liked to casually mention his father's business cons, had a balance that made his bragging look, frankly, a little pathetic. And when I finally caught my own reflection at the right angle in the dorm bathroom mirror, I saw it, a negative number. 3 digits, glowing an angry, embarrassed shade of red, like the number itself was ashamed to be seen in public. My name is Lan Bai, law student, permanently broke, allergic to asking my parents for money, and now, apparently, cursed or blessed, depending entirely on the day, with the ability to see the exact contents of a stranger's bank account before they'd said a single word to me. For about 2 weeks, it stayed exactly that. A strange, useless party trick I never told anyone about, because who was going to believe me, and what was I even supposed to do with the information? Guess people's salaries for fun. Avoid restaurants where the waiter had more money than me. It felt less like a superpower and more like a very specific form of insomnia. I tested it on everyone within range out of pure boredom more than anything scientific. The woman who ran the little breakfast stall by the north gate, who I'd always assumed was barely scraping by, turned out to be sitting on a number that suggested 3 separate properties and a very comfortable retirement. The professor who taught contract law and drove the most beaten-up bicycle on campus had a balance so low I genuinely worried about him for a week before I found out he simply didn't believe in banks. I learned quickly that the number over someone's head told you almost nothing about how they actually lived, which was its own small, useless kind of wisdom. Mostly, I just walked around campus for those 2 weeks, feeling like an accountant with no clients and no reason to exist, filing away a skill I was fairly sure I'd take to my grave without ever using for anything that mattered. Then came the Tuesday that changed everything, and it started, of all places, in the cafeteria lunch line. I remember the exact moment. I was standing there with my tray, a bowl of the free soup, 2 of the cheapest vegetable buns on the menu, because it was the 3rd week of the month, and my monthly transfer from home had already evaporated into textbooks when I noticed a number hovering over the head of a girl standing a few spots ahead of me in line. I did a double take so violent, I nearly dropped my tray on the girl in front of me. 30 billion. Not 30,000. Not 30 million. 30 billion. Glowing enormous and steady above the head of the quietest, most unremarkable-looking girl in our entire department. Her name, I would come to learn, was Zhao. She was the kind of student most professors forgot existed the second they finished taking attendance. Full scholarship. The same 3 faded t-shirts on constant rotation, washed so many times the color had basically surrendered. Hair tied back with a plain black elastic that had clearly been used and reused past its natural lifespan. She lived, as far as anyone on campus knew, entirely off financial aid and the free soup station, and if you'd asked the student body to the poorest person at our university, half of them would have said her name without hesitation. I was still standing there, half convinced my ability had finally short-circuited from overuse, when the scene in front of me turned ugly fast. Lin Wei, campus it girl, dating the heir to a mid-sized restaurant chain, the kind of person who had strong, publicly stated opinions about other people's shoes, had cornered Shenji Jiao by the noodle counter. Somebody's milk tea had splashed a few drops onto Lin Wei's white sneakers, and without any real investigation into whose fault it actually was, she'd decided Shenji Jiao was to blame. "Are you deaf?" Lin Wei's voice cut across half the cafeteria. "You're paying to get these cleaned, or, I promise you, you won't be finishing this semester here." Shenji Jiao looked up at her slowly. Her expression wasn't fear, and it wasn't defiance either. It was something closer to a strange, practiced calm, like this wasn't the first time she'd had to absorb a scene like this. "I don't have any money," she said quietly. The crowd around them laughed. Someone muttered something about people needing to know their place. Lin Wei's boyfriend, designer jacket, a watch that probably cost more than my entire year's tuition, peeled 2 crisp 1,000 yuan notes out of his wallet and threw them onto the floor at Shenji Jiao's feet, the way you'd toss scraps to a stray animal you wanted gone. "That should cover a year of your meals. Now stay out of my girlfriend's way." I watched the number above Shenji Jiao's head flare a shade brighter, almost like it was reacting to her, absorbing whatever she was feeling and refusing to let a flicker of it show on her face. And something about the sheer, stupid absurdity of the moment, an entire cafeteria of people who could not combined out-earn her in 10 lifetimes, mocking her for being poor, tipped the whole thing over from infuriating into almost funny. I honestly don't fully know what came over me. I set my tray down on the nearest table and walked straight into the middle of it. "Sorry to interrupt," I said, crouching down to gather the bills off the floor. I stood, turned, and pressed the cash firmly back into the boyfriend's hand with the most professional smile I could manage. "You dropped this." His face went a color I didn't know human skin could turn. "That's not mine. That's for her, too." "Throwing money at someone in public isn't generosity," I said, still smiling. "It's a great way to end up on the wrong end of a harassment complaint. As a law student, I feel obligated to mention that." I turned to Lin Wei next, glanced at her shoes, and pointed out, just as pleasantly, that a splash of milk tea comes off designer sneakers with a wet wipe in under a minute, and that demanding 80,000 yuan in compensation for a stain that costs nothing to remove has a very specific legal name. And that name is extortion. She sputtered. Accused me of secretly having a crush on some poor loser. I pulled out my phone, opened the camera, and calmly informed both of them that I'd just recorded the entire exchange and that they were welcome to apologize now or discuss it with the Student Affairs Office instead. Her boyfriend, suddenly deeply uninterested in escalating things, grabbed her arm and dragged her away before she could say anything else. When the crowd finally dispersed, it was just me, Shenji Jiao, and a floor still faintly sticky with spilled milk tea. She thanked me quietly, almost like the words cost her something to say out loud. I told her not to worry about it, that I just couldn't stand watching people gang up on someone who couldn't fight back on equal footing. Then I noticed her looking at my tray. Free soup, 2 cheap buns, nothing else. And I got embarrassed enough that I mumbled something about being on a diet and bolted before she could ask any follow-up questions. I genuinely thought that was the end of it. A small, forgettable act of decency filed away in the back of my mind, along with everything else I did that week. I had absolutely no idea I'd just knocked over the first domino in what was about to become the strangest, most chaotic 4 years of my entire life. That night, a message request landed in my chat app out of nowhere. Blank profile picture, a single character username. It was her. She apologized again for dragging me into her drama. I told her it was fine, genuinely fine. Then, with no real warm-up, she asked why I'd helped her. I typed out the truest answer I had. Because what they were doing was completely out of line, and I couldn't just stand there and let it happen. I told her I wasn't anyone special. I just had a stubborn, occasionally inconvenient sense of justice that got me into trouble more often than I'd like. A minute later, my phone buzzed with a transfer notification. 1,000 yuan, sitting in my account with a note attached, lunch money. Eat properly. I nearly choked on my own spit. I sent the entire amount straight back, along with a fairly stern lecture about how her financial aid existed for her, not for buying soup for classmates who happened to do the right thing once by pure accident. She went quiet for a long, long time before finally replying with a single word, "Okay." I actually believed that was the end of the story. Life, as it turned out, had other plans. The very next day, my manager at my part-time cafe job pulled me into the back room, looking like she was about to be sick. She told me the major shareholder behind the cafe chain had received a formal complaint about my attitude with customers, and that corporate wanted me off the schedule immediately. No further explanation offered. I knew exactly which family owned a piece of that chain, and exactly why my paycheck had just quietly evaporated into thin air. I sat outside on a bench afterward, staring at my balance, a number so small it was almost comedic, wondering whether defending a total stranger over a cafeteria incident had really been worth losing the only steady income I had. That's when Shen Jijiao found me. She sat down beside me without a word, didn't ask what had happened, clearly didn't need to. When she finally asked quietly if I was upset, I told her I was fine, that I'd find something else eventually. She apologized again, which confused me at the time, because as far as I understood things then, none of this was her fault. Before she left, she handed me a small thermos she'd apparently packed herself. Braised pork, still warm, wrapped carefully in a cloth, like she'd carried it across campus that way on purpose. I ate the entire thing alone in my dorm room that night, mixing the leftover sauce into my rice and scraping the container clean, and it was, without any exaggeration, the best meal I'd had in over a month. The next morning, my old manager called me in an absolute panic, not to fire me a second time, but to beg me, almost tearfully, to come back. The cafe had been bought out overnight, completely, by someone with the surname Shen, and the new owner had personally requested that I be reinstated immediately, with a raise and a promotion to assistant manager on top of it. I hung up the phone in a total daze, sitting on the edge of my bed, trying to process the idea that someone had purchased an entire cafe chain over one part-time job. It felt less like romance and more like a slow-motion natural disaster carried out with extremely good manners. From that point forward, Shen Jijiao stopped being subtle, even though she never once stopped pretending to be. She'd coincidentally end up sitting across from me in the library every single evening. She'd coincidentally be standing right behind me in the cafeteria line. Extra pieces of meat would somehow migrate onto my tray. A jacket would appear draped over my shoulders whenever I fell asleep, studying too late. A spare umbrella would materialize out of nowhere on the exact days it rained. None of it looked practiced. All of it was, very obviously, carefully engineered by someone with an enormous amount of resources and absolutely no experience being subtle about anything. The full truth came out not because of anything I did, but because Lin Weiwei, humiliated and furious, went digging for revenge and found something far bigger than she bargained for. She cornered me in a hallway about a week later, delivering the news with the specific cruelty of someone who thinks they've just uncovered a scandal. Shen Jijiao wasn't poor at all. She was the long-missing heiress of the Shanghua Group, one of the largest conglomerates in the country, and by that point, apparently the entire university already knew it. I stood there absorbing the information while Lin Weiwei accused me of scheming my way into a fortune from the very beginning. I told her, honestly, that it didn't matter to me whether Shen Jijiao had 30 billion or 30 cents in her account. It had absolutely nothing to do with why I'd stepped in that day. That answer apparently offended her enough that she raised her hand to slap me across the face. The slap never landed. Shen Jijiao caught her wrist mid-swing, seemingly out of nowhere, and for the first time since I'd known her, the temperature around her visibly dropped. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't need to. She simply recited, flat and quiet, the direct line to her family's legal department, and I watched every last trace of color drain out of Lin Weiwei's face. Word of who she really was spread through the department like a struck match dropped in dry grass. By the time I got back to my dorm that afternoon, my roommate was already standing in the doorway, phone in hand, staring at me like I'd grown a second head. "Bro," he said, very slowly, "please tell me the forum post is wrong and you are not secretly dating the missing heiress of Shanghua." I told him I had no idea what he was talking about, which was, at that exact moment, still technically true. He didn't believe me for a second. By dinner, half our department had somehow gotten hold of my number and were sending congratulations I hadn't earned and didn't understand yet. Shen Jijiao pulled me away from all of it without a backward glance, and once we were alone in a quiet grove behind the lecture hall, she finally told me everything. Every heir to the Shanghua Group, she explained, was required to spend 1 full year living as an ordinary person before officially taking over the company. No money, no name, no shortcuts, so that they'd genuinely understand real life before being handed authority over other people's. Her poor student act hadn't been some elaborate performance staged for my benefit. It was a rite of passage that had simply, unluckily collided with me on the one day her usual security detail had a family emergency and left her briefly, accidentally exposed to people like Lin Weiwei. The cafe, she admitted, without a shred of hesitation, had absolutely been her doing. She couldn't let the person who defended her get hurt because of that defense. And then, standing in that quiet grove, she said the thing that actually knocked the wind clean out of me, that none of this had ever been about repaying a debt. She asked, plainly, and with more nervousness in her voice than I'd have expected from someone worth 30 billion yuan, whether I'd give her an honest chance to know me, not as the heir to a fortune, just as herself. I told her the truth, that I was a broke law student with a negative bank balance and absolutely no framework for processing what she was saying. She just looked at me, genuinely puzzled, and asked what one thing had to do with the other at all. What followed over the next few weeks was less a courtship and more a slow-rolling natural disaster carried out with impeccable taste. 10 supercars showed up outside my dorm the very next morning because I'd once complained, offhand during a late-night run, about the 15-minute walk to class. When I begged her over the phone to send them away, she agreed without argument and left exactly one behind anyway, a genuinely hideous hot pink one, because she thought I might like the color. I ended up riding to my morning lecture on the back of her electric scooter while the family butler trailed behind us at a respectful distance in that same pink car, looking entirely unbothered by how strange the whole procession must have appeared to everyone we passed. It escalated fast from there. A Michelin-starred chef parked a private food truck directly outside my dorm building because I'd mentioned once being tired of cafeteria food. The entire university library got quietly retrofitted overnight with premium eye protection lighting because I'd said the old fluorescents gave me headaches. The principal personally called to ask if the upgrade met my satisfaction. A private jet landed on the school's sports field because I'd mentioned, in passing, that I missed home. When my laptop finally gave out during a thesis draft at 2 in the morning, I woke up the next day to find 3 different, top-of-the-line models laid out on my desk, still in their boxes, with a note asking which color I preferred. When I mentioned, mostly as a joke, that my dorm's shower only ran hot water for about 90 seconds before turning Arctic, an actual plumbing crew showed up within the hour to renovate the entire floor's water heater system, much to the confused delight of every other guy on our hallway who had no idea whom to thank. Every single time I tried to talk her down, every single time she looked at me with genuine, wide-eyed confusion about why I wasn't thrilled. Underneath all of that chaos, though, something real was quietly taking shape. Once you looked past the impossible number floating above her head, Shenji Jiao wasn't a tycoon at all. She was painfully awkward, sharply intelligent, and generous in ways that had nothing to do with money. She simply didn't know any other language for showing she cared. She'd wear the same outfit for an entire week straight because I'd complimented it exactly once. She lit up, visibly and completely, over the smallest, most mundane things. Without quite noticing when it happened, I found myself falling for all the parts of her that 30 billion yuan could never have bought in the first place. Everything came to a head during finals season when I sat for an interview for a highly competitive scholarship, real money attached, plus a guaranteed internship at a well-respected law firm. I'd prepared for weeks, staying up late reviewing case law until my eyes blurred. The interview itself went smoothly, right up until the very end, when the lead partner looked up from my application file and asked, almost casually, how much of my presence in that room I honestly believed was earned through my own effort, and how much was owed to my well-publicized connection to the Shen family. He made it very clear the firm had no interest in hiring someone content to ride someone else's coattails. I don't remember what I said in response, mostly because I don't think I managed to say anything coherent at all. I walked out of that office feeling completely hollowed out, and I spent the rest of the day locked in my dorm room, ignoring every call and message that came through. My roommate eventually pried the whole story out of me, watching me sit in the dark like a man who'd lost something important. He told me, more gently than I expected from him, that the person I used to be, the one who'd stepped in to help a total stranger in a cafeteria without knowing she was worth a fortune, hadn't gone anywhere at all. I wasn't sure in that moment that I believed him. That evening, the family butler showed up at our dorm room door, and instead of trying to physically drag me anywhere, simply handed my roommate a tablet with a quiet request that I watch what was on it before deciding whether I wanted to see her. The footage had clearly been recorded earlier that same day. The same interviewer, sitting across a conference table from Shen Jijiao, visibly sweating through an apology before she'd even finished her opening sentence. Her voice on the recording was completely flat, without a trace of emotion, as she informed him she'd learned about the bribe he'd accepted from Lin Weiwei's family specifically to make my interview as humiliating as possible. She slid a folder across the table toward him, years of documented misconduct apparently compiled in under a day, and told him calmly that it was more than enough to end both his career and his freedom. By the time the recording cut off, he was on his knees. It hadn't been her wealth that engineered my humiliation. It had been Lin Weiwei striking with surgical precision at the one thing she knew would genuinely wound me. And Shen Jijiao, without saying a single word to me about it beforehand, had quietly gone to war on my behalf the moment she found out what had happened. I went to her apartment that night, without stopping to think it through. She was standing by a window in one of her family's properties near campus, looking smaller and far more uncertain than I'd ever seen her look before. The moment she saw my face in the doorway, she practically ran across the room, apologizing over and over for not protecting me well enough, as though any of this had ever been her fault to begin with. I told her the exact opposite was true, that I'd spent the entire day convinced I wasn't good enough for her, and she told me, without a trace of hesitation, that it was the reverse. Money, she said, was the single easiest thing in the world for her to acquire. My resilience, my stubbornness, my decency under pressure, those were things no amount of wealth could ever manufacture or purchase. We stayed up talking until the sky outside started turning gray, trading every insecurity either of us had ever quietly carried. And somewhere in the middle of that conversation, I realized we weren't nearly as different as I'd always assumed. We were both just trying to survive the world on our own terms, her against greed and hypocrisy, dressed up in expensive suits, me against poverty and self-doubt, dressed up in cheap ones. In the 2 weeks leading up to finals, the library basically became our second home. Shen Jijiao had apparently decided that if she was going to lose our bet, it wasn't going to be for lack of effort, and watching her study was honestly a little frightening. This was a woman who had, by her own admission, deliberately kept her grades average for years just to maintain her cover story, and now that the cover was blown, whatever academic ability she'd been hiding came roaring out all at once. She'd finish problem sets in half the time it took me, then quietly slide her notes across the table so I could check my own answers against them, never once making it feel like charity. I started half joking that she was single-handedly ruining the curve for the rest of us, and she'd just shrug and remind me, with total seriousness, that she had a bet to win. When our exam results were finally posted, I placed third in the entire department. She placed second, one single spot short of the bet she'd made me weeks earlier, that if she cracked the top 10, I'd officially, publicly agree to date her. She stood in front of the results board, looking genuinely devastated about missing first place, which made me laugh out loud right there in the hallway. Because I'd never once seen someone worth 30 billion yuan take a class ranking this personally. I told her I was keeping my end of the bet anyway, leaned down and kissed her on the cheek in front of half our department. I watched the most feared, most composed woman on campus, turn a shade of red I didn't know was medically possible, all the way from her ears down to her collarbone, and ask, in a voice much smaller than her usual one, whether I'd do that again. There was a particular Sunday, a few weeks into all of this, that I still think about more than almost anything else from that year. She'd shown up at my dorm unannounced, dressed down for once in plain clothes, and asked if I wanted to just walk around the city with her instead of studying. No cars, no butler trailing behind us. We ended up at a night market, 2 subway stops away, and I watched her try street food for what she quietly admitted was the first time in her life. Skewered lamb from a cart with a rusted grill, sold by a man who had no idea who she was and didn't particularly care. She burned her tongue on the first bite and laughed about it for the rest of the night. It was, she told me later, one of the best evenings she could remember having in years, and it had cost about 40 yuan total. I filed that away quietly. It told me more about her than any of the supercars ever had. Being her actual, official boyfriend turned out to be even more chaotic than being her secret crush. She bought an entire island for my birthday, fully intending to name it after me, and looked genuinely confused when I asked her to give it back. I tried, valiantly and largely unsuccessfully, to teach her how ordinary people lived, how to ride a public bus with exact change, how to use a coupon at checkout, how to haggle over vegetables at the wet market. Her first attempt at riding the bus nearly ended with her feeding her family's black card into the fare box. Her first attempt at using a coupon ended with her somehow spending more than the original listed price. Her first attempt at haggling ended with her offering the vegetable vendor a straightforward deal. Knock 10 cents off this cabbage, and she'd simply buy his entire stall for the day. He took the deal. She bought the entire stall. When internship season rolled around, I turned down the position she could have handed me directly, head intern of the Shanghua Group's legal department, and applied on my own to a mid-sized law firm instead, determined to build something with my own 2 hands. She never once tried to talk me out of it. Instead, she quietly became a client of that exact firm, routing every minor legal contract from her enormous conglomerate through their office, specifically requesting that I be the one to handle them. Within weeks I'd become, without ever asking for it, the busiest and most consistently productive intern in the building. My colleagues looked at me with an uneasy mix of admiration and envy. I understood I would probably never fully shake the label of the heiress's boyfriend. I decided, somewhere around that point, that I genuinely no longer cared, because the only opinion that had ever actually mattered to me had already seen exactly how hard I'd worked, long before anyone else bothered to notice. My mentor at the law firm, a senior partner who'd clearly heard the rumors by then, pulled me aside near the end of the internship and told me, with what sounded like genuine sincerity, that I had real instincts for the work, sharper than most first years he'd trained, connections or no connections. It shouldn't have meant as much to me as it did. I'd told myself for months I didn't need anyone's validation on this particular subject anymore. Turned out I still did, a little, and hearing it from someone with nothing to gain by flattering me was worth more than any of the 10 supercars had ever been. At graduation, standing under the spotlight as the outstanding student representative, I found her almost instantly in that enormous crowd, not seated in the reserved section up front, but sitting right where she belonged, shoulder to shoulder with our actual classmates, dressed elegantly but without a single trace of the 10 supercar energy from months earlier. I abandoned most of the speech, I'd carefully prepared the second I made eye contact with her. I told the entire auditorium that true wealth had nothing to do with the number sitting in a bank account and everything to do with the character underneath it, and that I'd learned that lesson from someone sitting in that very room. I watched the most composed, most ruthlessly efficient businesswoman I'd ever met quietly wipe her eyes as I said her name out loud in front of the entire graduating class. We moved into a small apartment near the university not long after, not one of the countless luxury properties already sitting under her family's name, but an ordinary place we found and picked out together, small enough to actually feel lived in. She officially took over as head of the Shanghua group and became busier than I'd ever seen her, buried under an endless rotation of meetings and paperwork that stretched deep into the night. And yet, no matter how late it got, she always came home. Badly reheated late-night snacks became a running joke between us. She'd sit quietly beside me on the couch, keeping me company while I studied for the bar exam, occasionally falling asleep mid-sentence with her head against my shoulder. Sometimes, watching her sleep like that, I'd quietly use my ability out of old habit and glance at the number still hovering above her head. A figure so large by that point, I genuinely couldn't calculate it in my head anymore. But it had stopped making me feel small a long time before that. I knew by then exactly what warm, stubborn person that cold number was actually protecting. One night, curled up together on the couch, watching a rerun neither of us was really paying attention to, I asked her, half joking, whether she'd have still wanted anything to do with me if our situations had somehow been reversed, if she'd been the one to see a negative balance hovering over my head. That very first day, before either of us knew anything else about each other, she didn't hesitate for even a second. She said she'd have thought exactly what she actually did think, back in that cafeteria, that here was someone drowning quietly in debt who still got up every single day and tried anyway, and that people like that were worth paying attention to, worth protecting, regardless of what their bank account said about them. Then she leaned in, kissed me on the cheek, and said, very matter-of-factly, that the only sensible solution to a permanently negative number was to add another name directly beside it, for good. It took me a full 5 seconds sitting there on that couch to understand she'd just proposed to me, mid-sentence, over a rerun playing quietly on the television. I didn't answer her with words at all. By that point in our lives, I think we'd both figured out we never really needed them. Looking back on the whole strange, chaotic story now, I've come to believe the most valuable thing that ability ever gave me wasn't the shock of seeing 30 billion yuan floating above a stranger's head in a college cafeteria that first Tuesday. It was learning, slowly and against my own instincts, to look straight past that glowing number entirely and to find underneath it the one person actually worth everything I had, which, for the record, at the time we met, amounted to considerably less than nothing at all.